Hi everybody, my name is Nicole and this is my session 5 visual and verbal response. To begin with the informational content summary. So are police officers trained for mental illness? This slide is in regards to the video, Meet Police Officers Trained to Respond to Mental Illness Calls. So this video shows in the beginning how a man was shot because he had schizophrenia and he was not listening to the police officer's orders. He was having a schizophrenic episode, which the police officers did not know how to handle, so they did shoot him. So in the video, it gives us a statistic that officers are trained for 60 hours on how to hold a gun, but only 6 hours learning techniques how to handle the mentally ill. So in this case, with the 6 hours of training to handle the mentally ill, their police officers are referring to violence, which is ending up killing people only because they have a mental illness. There was another statistic in this video. 15 to 20% of law enforcement agencies have crisis intervention programs. Now, 15 to 20% is a very low percentage, especially compared to how many mentally ill people there are in the world. So I do think this number needs to increase. Also in the video, there were two undercover officers who specialize in the mentally ill, and they were called for a scene, and in the scene, the victim, he had actually died, and one of the interviewers he that was covering the scene, he said, "I saw two cops go in and I saw two human beings coming out." So this basically just meant that, you know, the officers that are trained for mental illness, the situations that they experience and they go through it does have an effect on them as human beings. Also, people with mental illness issues are going to jails instead of institutions for what they're doing, and the jails aren't being effective about their mental illness, so they should be going to institutions. The crisis intervention team, the video, How Memphis Has Changed the way police responded to mental illness crisis. So a crisis intervention team is specially trained to help people with mental illness. There was an officer named Chris Ross. He uses verbal techniques to de-escalate situations and try to keep people with mental illness issues out of jail. Chris Ross had shown ample amount of compassion towards the people that he was getting calls for. He would talk to them and he would get real personal with them in order for him to gain their trust, which I think is very important when dealing with people with mental illness. Now we're going to be discussing gun laws and disabilities. So people with disabilities are being killed by officers frequently. Officers, they handle these unthreatening situations with violent force just because that's what their go-to solution would be. Officers, they're not trained to handle a situation of a person with mental health or disabilities. Innocent people with disabilities are being killed because of the lack of knowledge about disabilities. There was a woman who she actually lost her son who had Down syndrome because he was not listening to a police officer, so they used great force towards him, and he actually ended up dying. So his mother says that she's sometimes struck by the level of ignorance about disability among officers, but that is simply mirrors back the lack of awareness that society has as a whole. Another quote that was in the article was, according to the database maintained by the Washington Post, in 2018, at least 139 people with mental illness have been shot and killed by cops. I am personally struck by this piece of statistic because they should not be unless they are being threatening, they should not be shot by cops just because they have a mental illness or they're not listening. They should be being talked to with compassion and be dealt with by certified people that are trained to deal with people with mental illness. The media is just not covering how many people with disabilities are being killed by police officers. The complications of marriage. So when having a disability, there's no rules stating that disabled people cannot marry, but with marriage comes financial struggles. This means that Social Security leaves a disabled person to think twice before they get married because of what might be taken away from them. For example, if they're married, they could lose their health care benefits, income, savings, just because they're married to somebody else who is not disabled, or who is disabled and they're going to be making too much, so Social Security does not want to support them anymore. And then Jones stated that losing medical coverage can be a literal matter of life or death for many disabled people who could not afford the life-sustaining medical care if forced to pay for it out of pocket. So if disabled people were wanting to get married, they would lose their medical coverage, so they literally have to choose whether they would like to live or get married, which is a choice they should not have to make. So they have to choose between marriage or their health care. Sex, relationships, and disabilities. Members of the disabled community express their voices of how they are not seen as capable of being sexually active. Lolo, in her videos, she discussed how she kept her wheelchair a secret on online dating, but then realized she should not be embarrassed of this. She said that she would post pictures without the wheelchair at first because she thought it would not attract men. But then she realized, that is a part of who she is. So she's not embarrassed of it, and a man is gonna want to be with her because she's in a wheelchair. She also emphasizes how people in wheelchairs should not be objectified by their devices, and be respected as a person when it comes to sex. She states this. There's a statistic that states from Channel 4 News that 5% of people have ever been asked out on a date with a disabled person, and 76% have never invited a disabled person to a special occasion, which is kind of sad because people just think disabled people are not able to be in relationships or be sexually active, or go out with the society and act as a non-disabled person, which is very saddening. Sex surrogates. A surrogate does engage in sexual activity with the client. They engage in work regarding sexual difficulties, for example, erectile dysfunction, anxiety, lack of confidence. They practice sex or masturbation with support. So now going on to my analytical context summary. So police responding to a mental illness call. So I was very saddened to hear about the events that took place, of how officers responded to several situations regarding a mentally ill person. I just did not think that they would respond in such violent force, especially shooting a person just because they either would not listen to them, or tase them to death, because they wouldn't listen. Knowing that they are mentally ill, officers still took extreme precaution ending the lives of innocent people. I think the lack of training that the officers received to handle these situations is what leads to the tragic deaths of innocent people. I really enjoyed and respected how Chris Ross responded to his calls for a mentally ill person. He shows compassion and patience to make the person feel safe without any harm being done. And in the video, it shows that he does an amazing job at it, and he respects the person rather than treating them as they're not even a person. Police officers handling disabled people. I do believe more police officers should become educated and aware of how to handle people with disabilities. So the situation that was in one of the articles with Robert Ethan, which is a 26-year-old male with Down syndrome, it made me feel disgusted and saddened for Robert and his family, because there was no reason for this young man to die. He just wouldn't get out of the movie theater, and he just sat there, and they decided to use great force upon him, which led to his death. The police officers did not act as they should. He shouldn't have died in this situation whatsoever. He wasn't armed or anything. So I think if these police officers were more educated and taught techniques of more civil ways to handle these situations, innocent disabled people's lives would not be put at risk. Modified gun laws and gun license. I think it is fair to make special laws for those who identify as mentally ill or disabled. It is important that someone who specializes in disabilities handles these calls in order to save the lives of disabled people from getting shot and killed. There should be mental evaluations, screenings, history when applying for a gun license in order to keep the owner safe as well as the community. For example, if somebody with schizophrenia has a gun license, they might unintentionally hurt themselves or others during the schizophrenic episode. So I do think that these mental health evaluations should be done in order just to keep the owner and the people in the community safe. Disabled people having sex. So there was a lot of misconceptions about disabled people having sex. That people think that they're not sexually active or they cannot be sexually active. So actually, this reminds me of when I attended the Crip Camp discussion panel a few weeks ago, and there was a speaker. Her name was Taylor. She's disabled, and she had shared her experience of how she would go to the doctor's office, and they would never ask her if she was sexually active, which is very surprising because they would ask me, or, my friends would say that they would ask them as well. She states that the first time she was ever asked if she was sexually active was when she was 22 years old and they saw an engagement ring on her finger. So I do think this is shocking because even healthcare physicians are showing signs of discrimination by not giving the same care to the disabled patients as they would as a non-disabled patient. Sex surrogates. This term was new to me, and I was shocked to see that there was these kind of services. It does upset me that disabled people are not able to express themselves sexually due to their discrimination against them, that people think that they cannot or are not sexually active. One of the arguments that was brought up in the text, beginning with disability, by Davis, was that if sex workers for disabled clients are more safer for the industry. I think this aspect of the industry would be safe because it would be helping the disabled person fulfill their sexual needs, which is difficult for them to do daily because of the discrimination. So a sex surrogate, would also help the client practice their sexual autonomy, determining who, when, and where they would like to have sex with. The marriage restrictions. When reading about the different restrictions disabled people have when it comes to marriage, I was very saddened for them because most of their choices weren't their choices. The fact that the people with disabilities must decide between marrying somebody they love or having healthcare is unfair and frustrating. The article, some people with disabilities are prevented from getting married, and here's why. That article really opened up my eyes because of how disabled people must choose their disability over their happiness sometimes. Dominic, he shares how if he gets married, he loses his PCA services, and without those services, he's unable to live, basically. So if someone else is assisting him with these services, his Medicare services are taken away. So it's basically a lose-lose situation, which is horrible for them. And then these are my references. I hope you guys enjoyed my session 5 visual and verbal response. Bye.